Hey everybody, this is a chapter. It's the third chapter, if you're curious, uh, to Trotskyism, and the transition to socialism. Like I said, and I'm probably going. I don't know how much of any of this book I'm going to read as a whole, so I'm just going to release each chapter as a video, not really saying like, oh, it's chapter one of this whole book. Gives me a little more freedom in my choices of what I'm going to be reading. Where the hell's my coffee at? It's dark in here. Alright, let's party. From the Times Literary Supplement to the Sunday Telegraph, from Kingsley Martin to Isaac Deutscher, the authorities represented in the presentation of the 3-volume English edition of the History of the Russian Revolution all agree that Trotsky's historical work has no parallel save perhaps Churchill's. I don't know if I said the chapter of the title of the chapter, but it's titled Trotsky and History. I don't know who Kingsley Martin is, and it says that Kingsley Martin, usually known as, was a British journalist who edited the left-leaning political magazine The New Statesman from 1930 to 1960. Scholarly opinion broadly concurs. For the historian and Trotskyist Perry Anderson, Trotsky was the first great Marxist historian. Quote, for a long time, the history of the Russian Revolution remained unique in the literature of historical materialism, end quote. Others have viewed Trotsky enthusiastically. Others have viewed Trotsky enthusiastically as a historian producing the, quote, literature of revolution, end quote. Given the dominant tendency to identify Trotsky as the, quote, man of October, it is not surprising that the history of the Russian Revolution, the book, tends to eclipse Trotsky's other historical works. Trotsky's historical practice, in fact, produced works of an extreme variation. There is a marked unevenness between and even within some texts. Such unevenness is best revealed in the analysis not only of the classic History of the Russian Revolution, but also of the earlier work, 1905. That unevenness is further illuminated by the exposure of the historical presuppositions at work in Trotsky's biography of Stalin. The interpretation of these texts together can yield a deeper understanding of the problematic at work in Trotsky, the deep structure of which has been indicated in the previous chapters of this study. The teleological notions of history already evident in Trotsky's philosophy and economy emerge fully only in the consideration of Trotsky's historical writing itself. New section. 1905. Or, quote, 1905. Overshadowed by the history of the Russian Revolution, 1905, which is the book, remains an underrated series of studies. In accordance with his earlier rejection of textual fundamentalism, Trotsky's studies in 1905 provide a Marxist economic history marked by sensitivity to specificity and a theoretical rigor, bringing to mind even contemporary debates like the science and society dispute between Paul Sweezy and Maurice Daub, and others over the question of the transition from feudalism to capitalism and whether its source was in the application of merchant capital to artisan production or is internal to the new mode of production itself. Trotsky's explanation of the peculiarities of the Russian situation commence with its, quote, hothouse, end quote, development. Capital is imported. Capital is not accumulated within Russia's national confines, as capital was accumulated in the British case. Though substantially feudal, Russia is also characterized by the existence of highly intensive capitalist industry prior even to the abolition of serfdom. The emergence of, quote, free, end quote, Geographically and socially mobile labor in Russia at the hands of the Tsarist state thus contrast with its organic emergence in the classic British case of capitalist development. In Russia, it is only with the abolition of serfdom in 1861 that laborers became formally free to work where they will and to make their way up the ladder of the class hierarchy. Where in Britain modern towns emerge as productive centers, Trotsky explains the emergence of Russian towns primarily as administrative centers or trade markets. The Russian towns are commercial rather than productive centers and are therefore understood as dependent links with the world system of capital rather than as self-sufficient industrial productive bases. All Russia's characteristics combine to produce the picture of Russia's uneven development. Trotsky's own words provide an apt summary and indicate something of his literary verve. Quote, "Within this vast space, every epoch of human culture is to be found. From the primeval barbarism of the northern forests, where people eat raw fish and worship blocks of wood, to the modern social relations of the capitalist city." Sorry, I don't know if I said quote. Sorry, I'm spacing out. Quote, "Within this vast space, every epoch of human culture is to be found. From the primeval barbarism of the northern forests, where people eat raw fish and worship blocks of wood, to the modern social relations of the capitalist city, where socialist workers consciously recognize themselves as participants in world politics and keep a watchful eye on events in the Balkans and on debates in the German Reichstag. The most concentrated industry in Europe based on the most backward agriculture in Europe. The most colossal state apparatus in the world, making use of every achievement of modern technological progress in order to retard the historical progress of its own country." End quote. Trotsky. Yet the importation of capital and capital social relations into Russia was to place a time bomb under the Tsarist edifice, leaving in question only the nature of the outcome consequent on social explosion. Trotsky followed Plekhanov in borrowing heavily from the Russian historians, who gave special importance to the social and economic role of the state. Like Plekhanov, Trotsky saw climate and geography as partially explanatory factors for the peculiarities of Russian history. Going beyond Plekhanov, Trotsky came to view the absence of the Occidental city as the crucial factor distinguishing Russian from Western European feudalism. In this regard, it was Parvis and not Plekhanov who influenced Trotsky. Parvis was something, I think he was like a legal Marxist. Yeah, it says Alexander Parvis, or Alexander Lvovich Parvis, born Israel Lazarevich Gelfand, and sometimes called Helpand in the literature in the Russian Revolution, was a Marxist theoretician, publicist, and controversial activist in the Social Democratic Party of Germany. In this regard, it was Parvis, not back to the text. In this regard, it was Parvis and not Plekhanov who influenced Trotsky. Parvis had observed in his period of collaboration with Trotsky that Russian towns were closer to the Chinese administrative centers, doubling as bazaars, as Trotsky was to put it in Results and Prospects. The Russian towns performed only a consumptive, not a productive role. This fact accounting for the relative absence of a politically inspired bourgeoisie or petty bourgeoisie, and therefore provided the historical basis for the theory of permanent revolution. While the urban centers, lacking their own bourgeoisie, served as outposts for world capital, the vast spaces of Russia remained largely untouched by bourgeois culture or politics. The catalyzing influence of Parvis in this period of Trotsky's formation helped Trotsky to transcend the existing wisdom of Menshevism. Going beyond Plekhanov, Trotsky analyzed the specifics of the experience that was unique to Russia. The theory of permanent revolution at this stage of Trotsky's formation related specifically to Russia. It was not at this stage the universally applicable formula which it was later to become in the permanent revolution. The Trotsky of 1905, the book, denied the general philosophy of history of the kind which was popularized by Plekhanov. Indeed, for the young Trotsky, quote, where there are no, quote, special features, end quote, there is no history, but only a sort of pseudo-materialist geometry, end quote. It was only later that Trotsky was to deny such, quote, special features, end quote, and to construct such a, quote, geometry, end quote, of his own. The high quality of the analyses in 1905 should not be taken to indicate an internal uniformity in the collection. The seeds of the philosophy of history, later to be modified and made explicit, already exist in its pages. Trotsky's use of theatrical metaphor is particularly striking. Trotsky relates the experience of the trial of the Soviet of Workers' Deputies as theater, because it actually resembled theater more closely than history. But the choice of the theatrical form of historical presentation is more significant yet, as is shown elsewhere. Quote, classes cannot be seen at a glance. They usually remain behind the scenes, ... bracket, and later, end bracket. Gapon's priestly robe was only a prop in the drama. The protagonist was the proletariat, end quote. I believe that Gapon was like the priest who led Bloody Sunday, who led the marchers who were killed in Bloody Sunday in Russia. Georgy Apollonovich Gapon, who lived from 1870 to 1906, was a Russian Orthodox priest and a popular working-class leader before the 1905 revolution. After he was discovered to be a police informant, Gapon was murdered by members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Father Gapon was mainly remembered as an agent provocateur who led a peaceful crowd of protesters on Bloody Sunday to be met by firing squads of the Imperial Russian Army. Okay, back to the text. The generative metaphor at work here suggests that history is a moral play in which justice will confirm the proletarian cause in the long run. Generative metaphors we take to be there, which generate their own conclusions or solutions. Their use is fundamental to Trotsky. The abscess needs lancing, the gangrenous limb amputation, a medical intervention by Trotsky restoring health, growth, or development. The biological analogy is, of course, symptomatic of the Second International's conflation of natural and social sciences. That's basically, the gangrenous limb amputation thing is, I don't think he necessarily wanted to like a split in the party, but he viewed the arguments of Burnham, the bureaucratic collectivist arguments of James Burnham and the people around him, such as Max Shachtman and Martin Aburn, and the people that would eventually go on to form the U.S. Workers' Party. One of his longer pieces about that whole tendency, refer to it as something along the lines of like gangrenous petty bourgeois influences. Back to the text. This biological analogy is, of course, symptomatic of the Second International's conflation of natural and social sciences. This type of metaphorical appeal is pre-critical and a-reflective, playing on the persuasive power of the, quote, obvious, end quote, and the, quote, certain, end quote, to the detriment of the uncertain and the complex, and inserting, in this case, a motor of inherent development. Thus the imagery of, quote, titanic struggle, end quote, the resort to the images of growth and decay, the device of personification, and the imagery of clothing. In the piece, My Speech Before the Court, Trotsky personifies the insurrection, quote, an insurrection of the masses, gentlemen of the bench, is not made. It accomplishes itself. The insurrection of the masses is the result of social relations not the product of a plan. It cannot be created. It can be foreseen." End quote. A sharper example is provided by Trotsky's personification of the 1905 strike. Quote, "Where the telegraph refused to serve it, it cut the wires or overturned the telegraph poles. It halted railway engines and let off their steam. It, bracket, etc., end bracket. It used every possible means. It appealed, convinced, and implored. It threatened, terrorized, threw stones, finally fired off its Brownings. It wanted to achieve its aim at whatever cost." End quote. While the literary device is compelling, it can hardly be accepted as license in historical analysis, for the strike is hereby given a primordial necessity. Quote, "This strike is not merely itself, bracket, but, end bracket, is obedient to the will of the revolution which has sent it down through the land," end quote. History here drifts through the realm of literature and into that of theology. In the first instance, the implication of such imagery is that the strike authors the strikers. In the second, the strike itself is authored by the revolution. History becomes the playground of divine but delegated intervention. The image is one of rebirth via superhuman agency. Doubtless Trotsky succeeds in conveying the sense of spontaneity unique to such periods with consummate skill. Spontaneity is precisely the key, for it corresponds with his pre-October understanding of politics. Yet while the young Trotsky is free of the belief in a vanguard which stands in for the masses in politics, it must be observed that the argument for spontaneity was to provide no practical alternative to vanguardism. Though rousing the urban masses, the events of 1905 nevertheless resulted in defeat. The ancillary argument that the 1905 events, in functioning as the, quote, "dress rehearsal," end quote, for October, were no defeat but merely the preliminary to success, solves the problem only by collapsing the unique nature of events of 1905 into a preordained view of delayed necessity, reasserting the view of history as a moral play, only with altered chronology. If history is to be viewed not as theater, but rather as a realm of structural obstacles and human possibilities, a somewhat more contingent approach to its understanding and writing might be necessary. Finally, the more significant point in this context is that this kind of argument is more than receptive to Jacobin outcomes, in politics and historiography alike. The argument being put here is not that Trotskyism is bad because metaphorical. There is no discourse outside metaphor. The problem, rather, is that this kind of Second International discourse, with its language of generation/degeneration, necessity and nomos, itself invites Jacobin intervention, itself begs for the Bolshevik scalpel, which lances the abscess that the Plekhanovs and Kautskys merely watched and monitored. Trotsky's Jacobinism can therefore be observed in his historiography as well. New section. The book, quote, "The History of the Russian Revolution," end quote, history as theater and theater as history. Trotsky's book, History of the Russian Revolution, is a remarkable work from any point of view. At the history of the Russian Revolution's best, at its best, the narrative of the history runs like a transcribed oration, quickening, resting, quickening again. It has a great power of persuasion on this immediate level. Like John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution has a strange power to convey the intensity of events. This urgency, coupled with Trotsky's literary gift and his first-hand knowledge, combine to produce a text of extraordinary influence and value. Lunacharsky characterized Trotsky's achievements well when Lunacharsky wrote that Trotsky's, quote, articles and books are, as it were, frozen speech. He was literary in his oratory and an orator in literature, end quote. Lunacharsky is one of those people whose name I always see, but I never look up. So I'm going to look him up right now. Anatoly Lunacharsky, who lived from 1875 to 1933, and was a Russian Marxist revolutionary and the first Bolshevik Soviet People's Commissar, Narkompros, responsible for the Ministry of Education, as well as active playwright, critic, essayist, and journalist throughout his career. Back to the text. Trotsky's unique contribution as historian is to convey so effectively the feeling of 1917. Trotsky's narrative is excellent. His images of the dog-tired proletarian enthusiasm of 1917 are evocative in the extreme. Trotsky fascinates the reader with devices such as the change of tense from past to present correlative with the shift from context to the actual folding of events. Trotsky's is a masterly technique. The history of the Russian Revolution opens in a similar manner to 1905, beginning with the peculiarities of Russia's development. Like 1905, if to a lesser extent, the analysis of pre-revolutionary Russia in the history of the Russian Revolution is marked by a notable sensitivity to uneven development. Trotsky repeats the argument about the insignificance of the Russian towns before explaining the broader effects of the war and of Tsardom's decay. Next, the reader is taken through the February events to the July days, and finally to October and the conquest of power. Radically diverging critics all affirm that it is a gripping story. A deeper reading, however, reveals the same generative structure to be at work, constructing in advance a textual frame within which the reader cannot but agree with the author. The field of chosen metaphor is again primarily the organic one, of evolution so fundamental to Second International thinking. In one place, Trotsky almost seems to acknowledge the generative structure at work in his writing. Quote, physical analogies with revolution come so naturally, bracket, exclamation point, end bracket, that some of them have become worn-out metaphors. Quote, volcanic eruption. Quote, birth of a new society, end quote. Quote, boiling point, end quote. ... Under the simple literary image, there is concealed here an intuitive grasp of the laws of the dialectic. That is, the logic of evolution, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky's language is instructive. Physical analogies are not illegitimate, only overused. Physical analogies emerge naturally, revealing intuitive understanding of the working out of the laws of an evolutionist worldview. Consequently, it should come as no surprise that, quote, worn-out metaphors, end quote, pervade the history of the Russian Revolution. As has been seen in Chapter 2 of this study, the context for the use of such metaphor is a metaphysics called, quote, dialectics, end quote, which identifies social life with natural science, so that both are seen to be subject to the governance of law and therefore given to predictability. Trotsky thereby establishes a preordained teleology, which ensures both the defeat of various enemies and the inevitability of the Bolshevik victory through the use of metaphorical device. Images of natural necessity, including boiling, eruption, tidal, and solar movements, occur frequently in the text. Quote, molecular processes, end quote, are taken to be at work. Trotsky uses the Hegelian concepts of essence and appearance in order to assure that whatever the face of events suggests, history is really on his side, quote, below the surface, end quote. For the Bolsheviks were, quote, revolutionists of the deed and not the gesture, of the essence and not the form, end quote. Trotsky. Just as humans are powerless before the movement of flood or molecules or before the necessity of gravity or the seasons, So are humans impotent in the face of death or birth. Trotsky revels in gynecological metaphor and in the imagery of death and disease. The choice of the images of death and birth is especially significant. For the choice of the images of death and birth allow the combination of teleology of necessity with the fact of the power of the experts to intervene. The Bolsheviks with Lenin and Trotsky at their head emerge as gynecologists of the Russian Revolution. As Sontag observes, quote, disease metaphors were a staple of Bolshevik polemics, and Trotsky, the most gifted of all communist polemicists, used disease metaphors with the greatest profusion, end quote. In this, Trotsky conforms to a broader social tendency to characterize any object of disapproval as diseased. This is just a side note. I just want to read through the brief biography introduction to Susan Sontag. Susan Sontag was an American writer who lived from 1933 to 2004. She was also a critic and public intellectual. Susan Sontag mostly wrote essays, but also published novels. She published her first major work, the essay Notes on Camp, in 1964. Susan Sontag's best-known works include the critical works Against Interpretation in 1966, On Photography in 1977, Illness as Metaphor in 1978, and Regarding the Pain of Others, as well as fictional works The Way We Live Now in 1986, The Volcano Lover 1992, and In America 1999. Sontag was active in writing and speaking about or traveling to areas of conflict, including the Vietnam War and the siege of Sarajevo. She wrote extensively about literature, photography and media, culture, AIDS and illness, war, human rights, and left-wing politics. Sontag's essays and speeches drew controversy, as she has been called, quote, one of the most influential critics of her generation. I'm assuming that book, Illness as Metaphor, is where that quote on Trotsky comes from. Anyway, back to the text. In this, Trotsky conforms to a broader social tendency to characterize any object of disapproval as disease. Disease and health are in general presented as a mutually exclusive couple. However, in Trotsky, this broader social trait takes a particularly extreme form, so that disputation, that is, pluralism, equals, quote, disease, end quote, where, quote, health, end quote, seems to be associated with the image of a monovocal, stable society. The kind of argument which Sontag advances, that illness is not appropriate as metaphor, is dismissed in advance by the Bolsheviks. For Trotsky, the process of world revolution is written into the very order of things. But, quote, those who know, end quote, must step in to take control of events. In this regard, Trotsky's text is entirely a foregone conclusion. It is, quote, history read backwards, end quote, establishing the, quote, fruit, end quote, already in, quote, seed, end quote, in the beginning. The, quote, seed, end quote, is in fact only a retrospective projection of the author's modified Second International worldview. Beyond this level of metaphor in Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution is another equally provocative, the image of history as theater. As a preliminary, it is appropriate here to introduce Trotsky's later views on historiography. In a manner quite distinct to that of his self-understanding in 1905, the book 1905, Trotsky insists that the book, History of the Russian Revolution, is a work of history, to be understood as the science of history. The exposure of laws, the primary historical task involved, necessitates from Trotsky the application of the method of historic objectivism. The precise nature of these laws, whether they are properly social or natural, is never made clear. The quote laws, end quote, of uneven and combined development are quote applied, end quote, only occasionally and elliptically, occasionally and elliptically in the history of the Russian Revolution. It is this pursuit of quote objectivism, end quote, which makes necessary Trotsky's use of the third person in the text. For the later Trotsky, the use of the quote subjective tone, end quote, is not permissible in the writing of history. The use of the third person is a peculiar device, though it must be conceded that Trotsky finds himself in a rare predicament as the historian cum revolutionary participant. However, the resulting effects are perhaps worse than the problem which the device seeks to solve. In writing himself out of the text as subject, Trotsky ensures that he reappears as agent, as the bearer of a historical process already in motion. Further, Trotsky's self-objectification produces an absence that is strikingly present. As Wart puts it, Trotsky's, quote, use of the third person in quotation when speaking of himself as a historical figure is all the more conspicuous for its attempt at inconspicuousness, end quote. Who the fuck is Wart? I think it's a reference to Robert D. Worth. He looks like he's some kind of Slavic scholar. There doesn't seem to be much on him. Just says that he was a professor emeritus of history at the University of Kentucky. So where am I? Back to the text. In allocating himself a role in the plot of History of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky conforms to the broader Marxist tendency to think in terms of history as theater and of actors as bearers. Early on in the analysis of Tsarism, Trotsky makes it clear that force of the monarchy operates through its bearers. The force of the monarchy operates through its bearers. As Trotsky puts it, history writes the scripts. The actors have only the scope of interpretation. Subsequent images of the stage, of theater or the orchestra are again manifold. Either the actors are allotted specific analogical parts, Kerensky and Kornilov, for example. I'm not going to look those up, but Kerensky was the head of the provisional government, and Kornilov was a general, I believe, who tried to overthrow the Soviets and the provisional government in in the summer. Now I have to look it up, god damn it. Yeah. It says Kornilov was a Russian military intelligence officer, explorer. He lived from 1870 to 1918. And he was a general in the Imperial Russian Army during World War I and the ensuing Russian Civil War. Kornilov was of Siberian Cossack origin. Today, Lava Kornilov is best remembered for the Kornilov Affair, an unsuccessful endeavor in August-September 1917 that was intended to strengthen Alexander Kerensky's provisional government, but which led to Kerensky eventually having Kornilov arrested and charged with attempting a coup d'etat, and ultimately undermined Kerensky's rule. Okay, I was wrong. See, good thing I looked it up. Kornilov escaped from jail in November 1917 and subsequently became the military commander of the anti-Bolshevik Volunteer Army, which took the charge of anti-Bolshevik opposition in south of Russia. Kornilov and his troops were badly outnumbered in many of their encounters, and he was killed by a shell on the 13th of April 1918, while laying siege to Ekaterinodar, the capital of the Kuban Soviet Republic. So back to the text. Either the actors are allotted specific analogical parts, Kerensky and Kornilov, for example, vie for the part of Bonaparte, or else they are personified, where in a fashion reminiscent of the book 1905, the Soviet, or mass, appear on the stage as collective subjects, where, in Jacobin imagery, thousands lift their hands on one man, come out as one man, and so on. Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Miliukov all represent types of roles prevented from achieving the status of celebrity by stereotypical flaws in their clays, flaws of intellect or will. Let's read this thing on Lev Kamenev. Lev Kamenev lived from 1883 to 1936 and was a Russian revolutionary and Soviet politician. Lev Kamenev was born in Moscow to parents who had both been involved in revolutionary politics in the 1870s. Lev Kamenev joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1901 and was active in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Lev Kamenev participated in the failed Russian Revolution of 1905. Relocating abroad in 1908, Lev Kamenev became an early member of the Bolsheviks and a close associate of the exiled Vladimir Lenin. In 1914, Lev Kamenev was arrested upon returning to St. Petersburg and exiled to Siberia. Lev Kamenev was able to return after the February Revolution of 1917, which overthrew the Tsarist monarchy. In 1917, Lev Kamenev served briefly as the equivalent of the first head of state of Soviet Russia. Lev Kamenev disagreed with Lenin's strategy of armed uprising during the October Revolution, but nevertheless remained in a position of power after the fall of the provisional government. In 1919, Kamenev was elected full member of the First Politburo. During Lenin's final illness in 1923 to 1924, Lev Kamenev was the acting leader of the Soviet Union, forming a troika with Grigory Zinoviev and Joseph Stalin, which led to Leon Trotsky's downfall. Stalin subsequently turned against his former allies and ousted Lev Kamenev from the Soviet leadership. Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev would later align with Trotsky and form the United Opposition from 1926 to 1927. Along with Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev was expelled from the party 3 times. Kamenev was arrested in 1935 following the assassination of Sergei Kirov and made a chief defendant in the 1936 trial of the 16, which marked the start of the Great Purge. Lev Kamenev was found guilty during the show trial and executed by a firing squad on August 25th. Lev Kamenev coincidentally died on the same day as Sergei Kamenev, with whom he was not related. It says Grigory Zinoviev was a Russian revolutionary and Soviet politician. He lived from 1883 to 1936. An old Bolshevik, Zinoviev was a prominent figure in the leadership of the early Soviet Union and served as chairman of the Communist International, the Comintern, from 1919 to 1926. Born in Ukraine, then part of the Russian Empire, to a Jewish family, Zinoviev joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1901. Zinoviev sided with Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks in the party's 1903 split with the Mensheviks, becoming one of Lenin's closest associates. Grigory Zinoviev spent time in exile with Lenin and returned with Lenin to Russia after the February Revolution of 1917. Before the October Revolution, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev opposed an armed seizure of power, losing the trust of Lenin, who began relying on Leon Trotsky. During Lenin's final illness and after his death in 1924, Zinoviev allied with Lev Kamenev and Joseph Stalin against Trotsky. The, quote, troika, end quote, fell apart, and in 1926, Zinoviev and Kamenev briefly entered with Trotsky in the United Opposition against Stalin. This alliance was defeated. Zinoviev was expelled from the party in 1927 and soon readmitted after submitting to Stalin. After the assassination of Sergei Kirov, a close ally of Stalin, in 1934, Grigory Zinoviev was accused of complicity in Kirov's killing, convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. While imprisoned in 1936, Zinoviev was further accused of treason during the Stalinist Great Purge, and he was executed after a show trial in August 1936. Pavel Milyukov lived from 1859 to 1943 and was a Russian historian and liberal politician. That's not who I'm looking for. Wrong guy. I guess, maybe it's not the wrong guy. Pavel Milyukov, who lived from 1859 to 1943, was a Russian historian and liberal politician. Milyukov was the founder, leader, and the most prominent member of the Constitutional Democratic Party known as the Cadets. Milyukov changed his view on the monarchy between 1905 and 1917. In the Russian Provisional Government, Milyukov served as foreign minister working to prevent Russia's exit from the First World War. So back to the sentence that these all names are from. Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Milyukov all represented types or roles prevented from achieving the status of celebrity by stereotypical flaws in their clay, flaws of intellect, or will, or both. The treatment of Martov as bearer, as, quote, Hamlet of democratic socialism, end quote, stands out. I'm not going to read Martov's thing. I'll assume that people know who Martov is, because I know who Martov is. Says Trotsky to Martov and his followers, quote, "You are pitiful, isolated individuals. You are bankrupts. Your role is played out. Go where you belong from now on, into the rubbish can of history," end quote. History is a god for Trotsky. Trotsky idolizes history, although it is later to sit in harsh judgment on him as well, as the defeats of the 20s and 30s accumulate. Trotsky's presentation resembles Sophoclean tragedy with its catharsis and clear moral lessons. Right wins out. Tragedy befalls those whose acts are false. Catharsis dissolves in the anxiety of the audience. The central blunder in Trotsky's text is precisely this presumption that right, the proletariat, will win out in history as in theater. The problem foreshadows another. Trotsky, it can be expected, will be in real difficulty attempting to explain the later success of Stalin, for the victory of the mediocre, of the wicked, violates Trotsky's positive philosophy of history by changing the character of necessity itself. Trotsky's treatment of his own part and that of Lenin in the Russian Revolution has generated some interest in the past because of his tendency to present the Bolshevik victory as a fait accompli. Writing himself out of the text as subject, Trotsky submerges himself in the process allegedly characterized by, quote, the historic destiny of classes, end quote. In a famous passage in his 1935 diary, Trotsky contemplates his own version of the proverbial falling brick. Trotsky offers the following as a general explanation of Lenin's role, and his own, in events that shook the world. Quote, I had not been present in 1917 in Petersburg. Had I not been present in 1917 in Petersburg, the October Revolution would still have taken place, on condition that Lenin was present and in command. If neither Lenin nor I had been present in St. Petersburg, there would have been no October Revolution. The leadership of the Bolshevik Party would have prevented it from occurring. Of this I have not the slightest doubt. If Lenin had not been in Petersburg, I doubt whether I could have managed to overcome the resistance of the Bolshevik leaders, end quote, Trotsky. How can Trotsky explain that Lenin was the only, quote, revolutionary, end quote, in the Bolshevik Party, himself aside, after October 1917? How can all the dimensions of the picture of necessity established via his elaborate generative metaphorical structure be reconciled with this picture, where all depends on the will and skill of one man? This is the uncomfortable silence in Trotsky's explanation, one which is resolved only falsely by the characterization of Lenin as the man of decision, as himself the product of necessity. Quote, Lenin was not an accidental element in the historic development, but a product of the whole past of Russian history. Lenin was embedded in it with deepest roots, end quote. The argument is essentially Plekhanov's. Just as Stalin was later to be cast as the product or personification of, quote, backwardness, end quote, so is Lenin portrayed as the bearer of progress, whose historic mantle is passed on to Trotsky. But if, quote, great men, end quote, merely personify great historical forces, why did Stalin win and Trotsky lose the struggle for power after Lenin's death? And what becomes of the empirical masses? Trotsky's subsequent difficulties in explaining Stalin's victory did not, however, imperil his philosophy of history, presumably because the self-willed commitment to such a philosophy of history is, strictly speaking, pre-rational. And Trotsky did see Marxism as a matter of faith. This is not to deny that there are real differences for Trotsky, the historian, in trying to find a particular place for himself as actor in the unfolding of historical events. Whatever the circumstances, Trotsky lacks the critical distance from the events of October to write a more accurate history, not history wie es eigentlich gewesen war, but not history as quote, it ought have been, end quote, either. Let me see. The hell this this German word means. It doesn't say here, and I don't speak German. Like it actually had been. That's what it means. So let me repeat the sentence with the translation. Whatever the circumstances, Trotsky lacks the critical distance from the events of October to write a more accurate history, not history like it actually had been, but not history as, quote, it ought to have been, end quote, either. Trotsky is too historiosophical a Marxist to perform adequately the historian's task. As Lunacharsky portrayed him, Trotsky always had one eye in the mirror of history. Trotsky was always, quote, ready to make any personal sacrifice, not excluding the greatest sacrifice of all, that of his life, in order to go down in human memory surrounded with the aureole of a genuine revolutionary leader. End quote. Lunacharsky. Bernard Shaw offers a similarly enlightening reflection on Trotsky. Like Lessing, when Trotsky, quote, cuts off his opponent's head, he holds it up to show, and there are no brains in it, end quote. George Bernard Shaw. Lessing was a philosopher, I believe. It says Gotthold Lessing lived from 1729 to 1781. He was a German philosopher, dramatist, publicist, and art critic, and representative of the Enlightenment era. Lessing's plays and theoretical writings substantially influenced the development of German literature. Lessing is widely considered by theater historians to be the first dramaturg in his role as Abel Seyler's Hamburg National Theater. Back to the text. Certainly Trotsky had a sense of the spectacle, of the performance in political and intellectual life. Trotsky's tendency to conduct the literary executions of various powerful enemies seems to create a situation of reversal, on paper. Trotsky writing in exile can, for a brief moment, relive better times, when historical justice chose the victors and the defeated with more discernment. In exile, the glory of the apogee of his personal life is therefore made somehow permanent. The rhetor, I don't know what the fuck that word means. Rhetor? Like rhetoric? I guess that's what it means. Rhetor is a teacher of rhetoric. An orator. The rhetor of Petrograd now addresses a distant audience. The world historic executors are executed by literary means, achieving poetic justice for the Trotsky who could achieve vengeance of no other kind against Stalin or against history. True to his early pseudonym, the quote, pen, end quote, never fully understood the limits of its power against the sword. Trotsky's use of metaphors, however, by no means completely vacuous. In some cases, its application is superbly sarcastic. Trotsky's use of the image of the theater is on occasion quite sharp, particularly in those instances where it was the circumstances themselves which did the mocking, as in the example of leftist conferences actually taking place in theaters. Trotsky was an able rhetor indeed. Even, and perhaps especially in his most vitriolic moments, he was a master of language, whether caricaturing the crepuscular Kerensky, or portraying Kautsky in his slippers, or teasing Hilferding, who enters the revolutionary epoch with his heavy book on his back, a turtle-like porter. Elsewhere, mechanistic imagery is put to good use. Quote, the fact that the Earth's axis is merely an imaginary line does not, of course, prevent the Earth from rotating on its axis. In like manner, the Kornilov operations rotated around an imaginary insurrection of the Bolsheviks as round its own axis. End quote. Trotsky. Other mechanical metaphors, the most famous of them being the image that mass is to party as steam is to piston box, are less convincing if ingenious in conception. Indeed, some examples are awkward in the extreme. Among them, Trotsky applies in his History of the Russian Revolution an image of Bonapartism which resurfaces in his analysis of fascism. Quote, if you stick two forks in a cork symmetrically, it will, under great oscillations from side to under very great oscillations from side to side, keep its balance even on a pinpoint. That is the mechanical model of the Bonapartist superarbiter. End quote. The symbol invoked, if curious, is not unreasonable. The image summoned is one of a tenuous but adequate self-suspension, momentary and contradictory. More perplexing from the viewpoints of politics and physics alike is the contraption presented as Bonapartism in, quote, the worker state Thermidor and Bonapartism, end quote, which, quote, by its very essence cannot long maintain itself, a sphere balanced on the point of a pyramid must invariably roll down one side or the other, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky proceeds to disavow the historical analogy with Napoleon, but not the physical image, as though the political world were analogous to the contrived vacuums of the laboratory. Yet Trotsky can simultaneously apply with much effect punning images like that of the theater, actual and metaphorical, and can produce such moving tragic parody as his Aesopian tale of social fascism in, quote, what next, end quote. Quote, a cattle dealer once drove some bulls to the slaughterhouse, and the butcher came nigh with his sharp knife. Quote, let us close ranks and jack up this executioner on our horns, end quote, suggested one of the bulls. Quote, if you please, in what way is the butcher any worse than the dealer who drove us hither with his cudgel? End quote, replies the bulls. who had received their political education in Manuelski's Institute. Quote, but we shall be able to attend to the dealer as well afterwards, end quote. Quote, nothing doing, end quote, replied the bulls, firm in their principles to the councillor. Quote, you are trying to shield our enemies from the left. You are a social butcher yourself, end quote. And they refused to close ranks, end quote. Trotsky. Dmitry Manuelski lived from 1883 to 1959 and was an important Bolshevik revolutionary, Soviet politician, and academic who was secretary of the executive committee of the Comintern, the Communist International, from December 1926 to its dissolution in May 1943. Back to the text. The difficulty lies not in Trotsky's use of metaphor, but in metaphor's misuse. The certainty installed by the use of generative metaphor, whether in natural, mechanical, or gynecological form, establishes a discourse in which Trotsky's teleological philosophy of history presents itself as an indisputable science of history. In historiography, Trotsky's Marxism is therefore myth presented as science, and it is this which sets Trotsky apart from Sorel. Whatever the apparent similarities between Trotsky and Sorel, Sorel refused both teleology and Darwinism in theory, and self-consciously presented the myth of the general strike as myth, not as theory, for it has a functional rather than scientific character. Trotsky's presentation of Marxism, in contrast, is mythical despite itself, and is mythical despite or through Trotsky's pretensions to scientific, quote, objectivism, end quote. In consequence, the history of the Russian Revolution, the book, cannot warrant the general acclaim given it as a work of history. On the contrary, critical readers must refuse to be part of the history of the Russian Revolution's captive audience. For a captive audience is what Trotsky achieves in works like The History of the Russian Revolution, through Trotsky's use of language. The reader receives not only a signifier and a signified, but a teleological association as well, usually drawn from the language of Jacobinism, whether its active or passive mood. Trotskyists in this sense speak a language other than that of theory or common sense. Concepts like, quote, class, quote, history, quote, strike, quote, crisis, quote, movement, or, quote, development, quote, action, or, quote, actor, take on an additional associational meaning within Trotskyist discourse. The Trotskyist discourse exemplified in The History of the Russian Revolution is a language of seduction. As Barth explains, what allows the reader to consume myth innocently is that he or she does not see it as a semiological system, but as an inductive system. The language of myth, in this specific sense, naturalizes the language of myth's object, presents a system of values as a system of facts. In this specific sense, Trotsky's historiography functions as what Barth calls a mythology. It is an inclusive discourse with a necessitarian plot. I believe it's what it says here is Barths, which I think it's referring to Roland Barthes, but I think his name is pronounced Bart. Actually, let's see. Well, what does the internet tell us? probably Roland Barthes, actually.
Barthes.
God, I'm a genius. I bet you it's Roland Barthes. Bitch.
Roland Barthes.
Roland Barthes. Okay. And it says Roland Barthes, who lived from 1915 to 1980, was a French literary theorist, essayist, philosopher, critic, and semiotician. Barthes' work engaged in the analysis of a variety of sign systems mainly derived from Western popular culture. Roland Barthes' ideas explored a diverse range of fields and influenced the development of many schools of theory, including structuralism, anthropology, literary theory, and post-structuralism. Barthes is perhaps best known for his 1957 essay collection, Mythologies, which contained reflections on popular culture, and the 1967-1968 essay, The Death of the Author, which critiqued traditional approaches in literary criticism. During Barthes' academic career, Barthes was primarily associated with the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and the Collège de France. I don't know if I'm pronouncing any of that right, but you get the idea. Okay, so that's who Barthes is. New section in the actual text that I'm reading. The new section is titled, quote, Stalin, end quote, which is refers to his book, Stalin. Trotsky's biography of Stalin provides further material for the interpretation of Trotsky's historical and historiographical premises. The problematical nature of the text should be noted from the beginning. Only the first 7 chapters and the appendix, titled, quote, 3 Concepts of the Russian Revolution, end quote, were worked up by Trotsky himself. The remaining 5 chapters and 2 supplements being a combination of Trotsky's text in rough, his own citations, and editorial summaries and interpolations by Charles Malamuth. It says Charles Malamuth, who lived from 1899 to 1965, was an American journalist, writer, and translator known as an, quote, expert in Slavic languages, end quote, quote, Russian expert, end quote, and anti-communist. Charles Malamuth is best known over the years. He's best known over the years as I think there's a typo in Wikipedia. He is best known over the years as translator of Stalin and appraisal of the man and his influence by Leon Trotsky from 1941, for which Soviet communists attacked him as a Trotskyite in the 1940s, and Trotskyites attacked him as an anti-communist in the 2010s. I think this is a mess. Yeah, I don't know. It's weird. Maybe it's referring to literature that's been produced in the 2000s, but I don't know. That typo in the beginning makes me suspicious. Anyway, back to the text. The text is incomplete. Stalin, the book Stalin, is incomplete, uneven, and mediocre when placed alongside the history of the Russian Revolution. Unlike the history, Trotsky's biography of Stalin uses both personal reminiscences in the first person. Again, unlike the history, detail extended to the point of trivia overpowers both narrative and analysis. There is a relative absence of metaphor, and particularly generative metaphor, from the text. Apparently because the decay of Soviet socialism is inexplicable for Trotsky, and the likelihood of rectifying intervention at this stage becomes increasingly rhetorical. But it is these very weaknesses which make Trotsky's Stalin a revealing text. Trotsky's attempt to analyze Stalin borders on the psychopathological approach. The work is dominated by the attempt to establish the character of Stalin. Trotsky denies that Trotsky hates Stalin, but finds Stalin to be mediocre in the extreme and uniformly so across the years. Neither, quote, a thinker, a writer, nor an orator, end quote. Stalin was incapable of ever initiating anything. Stalin was without linguistic flair, ugly, had no memory, and felt compassion for neither man nor beast. One thing you could say about Stalin is that he wasn't ugly. It's kind of a meme, about young Stalin being hot. Significantly, Trotsky emphasizes Stalin's alleged pessimism and irrationalism, attitudes which are held in clear contrast to his own optimistic and rationalistic positions, the latter being positions which are presumed by Trotsky to be essential to Marxism. Stalin was ill-spoken, ill-read, and provincial. Stalin had a strong will but a weak intellect, is power-hungry and conspiring. Stalin is capricious, primitive, morose, slow, vile, banal, dry, inconsiderate, rude, ambitious, choleric, sly, stupid, vulgar, unforgiving, empiricist, and opportunist. Beneath the Trotskyist torrent of abuse exists an undeveloped contextual explanation of Stalin's character. Early on, Trotsky presents Stalin as representative of Russian backwardness, viewing Asiatic patriarchy and Asiatic cruelty as specifically Georgian remnants in Stalin's makeup. Trotsky offers a glimmering reflection of the images of apparent stasis in 1905 and in his history, portraying Georgia as a land of bazaars epitomizing Russian backwardness. The image recurs later when Trotsky presents Stalin as the personification of bureaucracy, a shift which is quite in order given Trotsky's conflation of, quote, bureaucracy, end quote, and, quote, backwardness, end quote. One conclusion can already be advanced. Having characterized Stalin as uniformly mediocre, Trotsky can neither explain Stalin's political success nor offer any substantial insights into Stalin's character. This is already particularly evident in Trotsky's refusal to allow Stalin any kind of power of initiative. Trotsky's comments concerning Stalin's alleged lack of imagination merely indicate that for Trotsky, quote, intellect, end quote, is identical to, quote, imagination, end quote. Stalin certainly suffered no shortage of political, quote, imagination, end quote, however brutal. Trotsky, that is to say, equates intellectual practice and political practice, and this equation must be seen as the source of his refusal to struggle concretely against Stalin after Lenin's death. Indeed, there is a strong sense in which Stalin's victory and Trotsky's defeat were premised on Stalin's manipulation of anti-intellectualism. As Boris Souverine explains it, Stalin's being other than intellectual was precisely the basis for Stalin's victory, for the claim to the heritage of October was to be based not on eloquence, but on numbers. In this somewhat more satisfactory explanation, it must therefore be conceded that Stalin won. Victory did not merely fall like the proverbial ripe fruit into his lap, for Stalin was the most clever aspirant to power, if not, quote, the best, end quote. Get a drink real quick. Trotsky fails to credit political skills which do not derive from the intellect. Trotsky himself rarely had the practical initiative in the inter-party struggle for leadership. Trotsky let pass the opportunities and responsibilities given Trotsky by Lenin to fight Stalin on the question of nationality and bureaucracy. Trotsky denied Max Eastman's expose of the existing power struggle and of Lenin's testament. At the 13th Party Congress in 1924, Trotsky put forward arguments which, far from strengthening his own case, actually served to bolster that of Stalin, morally entrapping himself in his infamous words, quote, the party is always right, end quote. Quote, my party, right or wrong, end quote. Those are famous words by Trotsky. One can only be right with the party. I just want to look at the Wikipedia of the 13th Congress real quick. The 13th Congress of the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks was held from the 23rd of May to the 31st of May, 1924, in Moscow. Of the delegates attending, 748 had voting rights and 416 had consultative rights. The Congress elected the 13th Central Committee. This Congress was the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks, first to take place after the death of Vladimir Lenin, and represents a transition between the Lenin and Joseph Stalin regimes. The 13th Congress of the Russian Communist Party was also the first confrontation between the left opposition, led by Leon Trotsky, and the Troika, led by Stalin, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev. Back to the text. In his lessons of October, Trotsky chose to attack Stalin's representatives, Zinoviev and Kamenev, rather than Stalin, who himself shrewdly remained behind the scenes. And in the most general sense, Trotsky accepted the argument about, quote, Trotskyism, end quote, as establishing the parameters of his dispute with Stalin, fighting on the latter's field of ideology rather than on the practical field of problems of Soviet construction, further undermining his reputation with the so-called, quote, practicals, end quote, in the party. Stalin's defeat of the opposition, the Shakti plot, Stalin's defeat of the opposition, the political victories of the assassination of Kirov, the Shakti plot, and finally the purges, all fail to register on Trotsky's scale of initiative. Quote, never in anything or anywhere, end quote, was Stalin, quote, an initiator. Let me look up some of these things. The Shakti trial, was the first important Soviet show trial. Since the case of the Socialist Revolutionary Party in 1922, 53 engineers and managers from the North Caucasus town of Shakti were arrested in 1928 after being accused of conspiring to sabotage the Soviet economy with the former owners of the coal mines. The trial was conducted on the 18th of May 1928 in the House of Trade Unions, Moscow. 34 of the accused received prison terms, while 11 were sentenced to death, with 6 being executed. The rest received commutations. The remainder were acquitted or received suspended sentences. I'll read the thing about Sergei Kirov. Sergei Kirov was a Russian and Soviet politician and Bolshevik revolutionary. Kirov was an early revolutionary in the Russian Empire and member of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Kirov became an old Bolshevik and personal friend to Joseph Stalin, rising through the Communist Party of the Soviet Union ranks to become head of the party in Leningrad and a member of the Politburo. On the 1st of December 1934, Kirov was shot and killed by Leonid Nikolaev at his offices in the Smolny Institute for unknown reasons. Nikolaev and several suspected accomplices were convicted in a show trial and executed less than 30 days later. Kirov's death was later used as a pretext for Stalin's escalation of political repression in the Soviet Union in the events of the Great Purge, with complicity of a common charge for the condemned in the Moscow trials. Kirov's assassination remains controversial and unsolved, with varying theories regarding the circumstances of the death. Back to the text. Trotsky's positive philosophy of history has no capacity for the measurement of evil in politics. Even after Stalinism, politics is seen by Trotsky as the technique through which the progress of humanity unfolds. This being the case, how is Stalin's victory to be explained? Did Stalin betray the revolution, or did the revolution betray its legitimate heir, Trotsky? Did Stalin author the bureaucracy, or was he the bureaucracy's product? Trotsky cannot take up these problems directly, for they broach too many fundamental questions, as McNeill puts it, I think it's Robert H. McNeill, but I'm reading actually an essay of his right now. Is there anything for Robert H. McNeill? It says Robert H. McNeill was an American historian, author, and expert in the history of the Soviet Union. Yeah, there's nothing else for it. But he wrote he's written a pieces on like Trotskyist interpretations of Stalinism. That's the piece I'm reading, at least. It's from Robert C. Tucker's book, Stalinism, Historical Interpretations, which has a bunch of commentators on the nature of Stalinism, not from a it's full of like actual historians of the Soviet Union, academic historians of the Soviet Union. Anyway, that's who McNeill is. Trotsky cannot take up these problems directly, for they broach too many fundamental questions. As McNeill puts it, quote, in a sense, Trotsky struggled to avoid making a Marxist analysis of Stalinism, end quote. Twice Trotsky suggests that Stalin created the machine. Elsewhere, the emphasis on Stalin as progeny of the machine. The Revolution Betrayed clearly suggests the latter argument, as does the manuscript, quote, What I Think of Stalin, end quote, where Stalin, quote, only plucked the ripened fruit of power, end quote. The more, quote, sociological, end quote, analysis implicit here is not reconciled with the more, quote, pathological, end quote, analysis in Stalin. Trotsky posits a contradictory schema where the options are necessity and or accident, mediated via the introduction of the traditional historiographical form of explanation, the great man. Clearly, accident cannot be given such a central place in Trotsky's philosophy of history, but nor after Stalin can necessity be easily ascribed a primary importance. If Stalin represents the necessary personification of an inevitable bureaucratization, then Trotsky's rationalist philosophy of history must be modified, allowing, quote, negative, end quote, forces to achieve, quote, positive, end quote, acts. Having endorsed a positive philosophy for so long, Trotsky cannot fully embrace a theory of repetition or decline, let alone countenance a more agnostic position. Though modified on occasions by the harsh realities of world developments in his period of exile, Trotsky's rationalism is far from suppressed. Writing in the period of fascism and Stalinism, Trotsky qualifies the simple unilinear teleology of history only by adding the vacillations of a, quote, highly complex and paradoxical orbit, end quote. The laws of history still lead to socialism, only the process is complicated by minor turns up and down which serve to delay the inevitable. One of the things that I was going to say is that Trotsky's analysis of the USSR seems like it's very much hemmed in by his optimism for the world, more optimism about history. So, for instance, the only conclusions there could be, obviously, he doesn't think that obviously, he's aware that there's defeats. Obviously, think there's some kind of huge political defeat in the Soviet Union and with fascism and setbacks and things like that, and defeats of the working class or whatever. But he ultimately has this idea that capitalism is in its death agony and that Stalinism is a highly unstable system, and that the socialist millennium is always like a priori right around the corner. There's no his idea is that the idea that the Soviet Union could be an established society, the idea that it could be a new form of oppressive society and not a kind of highly transitory, novel, precarious society, was extremely, extremely nauseating to him. Like the idea that perhaps Stalinism was there to stay for a while, and that it did constitute a new form of society, whether bureaucratic, collectivist, or state capitalist. That kind of outcome he found unacceptable. And it seems to me the idea that capitalism might linger on, or that Stalinism might linger on, or that their imminence in working class, like their imminent collapse into a socialist society, or at least the dictatorship of the proletariat. The idea that they could be, I don't know, somewhat stable and self-reproducing in a long-term fashion, did not jive with his overall positive historical conception that history was inevitably leading to socialism and leading to socialism soon. Yeah. That's just some thoughts to myself. Those aren't really anything that you should listen to. The laws of history, so back to the text. The laws of history still lead to socialism, only the process is complicated by minor turns up and down, which serve to delay the inevitable. This teleological self-certainty resurfaces later in a tragically naive form. Trotsky still adheres to the belief that, quote, the vengeance of history is more terrible than the vengeance of the most powerful general secretary. I venture to think that this is consoling, end quote. But the muse was little protection against the assassin sent by Stalin to Trotsky's fortress in Koyoakan. Koyoakan being where Trotsky lived. I think it's like a neighborhood. I don't know. I think it's like more like straight up part of Mexico City, but I think at the time it might have been more like I don't know, like its own thing. I wanted to say suburb, but that doesn't seem actually correct either, but I don't know. Trotsky's need for consolidation manifests itself on the level of faith. The quote ups and quote downs of the empirical dimension of politics succumbs to the positive philosophy of history, for which the only way is up. Logically speaking, the period of decline into the 30s should prompt in Trotsky the rejection of such a philosophy of history and a transference of interest to the empirical problems of consciousness related to decline. Trotsky was rather to reassert his faith. That faith is, as he put it in The Revolution Betrayed, quote, saturated with the optimism of progress, end quote. Further, for Trotsky, quote, it remains, of course, incomprehensible, at least with a rational approach to history, how and why a faction, least of all rich in ideas, should have gained the upper hand over all other groups, end quote. But history is not a simple moral play in which right, however defined, wins out, and Trotsky's explanation of Stalinism and of history remains hopelessly enigmatic, raising problems of reconciliation which were only to be broached later by Isaac Deutscher. Viewed from a critical distance, the scenario in Trotsky seems to reduce to an unsatisfactory scheme of personification. Stalin personifies retrogression. Trotsky personifies progress. His immediate defeat to be cancelled out in the advent of a delayed world historic victory. In this regard, Trotsky's understanding of history is indeed reduced to the view of the great man of traditional historiography, with the differences that warring titans represent and personify social classes or social forces. Trotsky self-consciously denies such an interpretation of his historiography. In Stalinism and Bolshevism, Trotsky reprimands Norman Thomas for failing to understand that, quote, It is not a question of a match between Stalin and Trotsky, but of an antagonism between the bureaucracy and the proletariat, end quote. However, this argument confirms Thomas rather than Trotsky. For, quote, Stalin, end quote, here is bureaucracy personified, while, quote, Trotsky, end quote, is the proletariat personified, if now in a fantastic sense, in exile, and via the absent mediation of the new international. Norman Thomas was the head of the Socialist Party of America, which the American Trotskyists had an entryist campaign into. The Trotskyists were part of Norman Thomas's party for a while before leaving it, I believe. Yeah. Norman Mattoon Thomas was an American Presbyterian minister who achieved fame as a socialist pacifist and six-time presidential candidate for the Socialist Party of America. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Yeah, back to the text. Is this tragic moralism in Trotsky which effectively produces a discourse which prevents a moral practical response to the decline of the 30s? Trotsky's response to Stalin's notorious rewriting of history is to reverse the casting of the story rather than writing the history itself afresh. Trotsky trivializes Stalin in order to idolize Lenin. Trotsky informs his readers that Lenin, quote, wholly inspired, end quote, Stalin's only theoretical work, Marxism and the Nationalities Problem. Trotsky tells that Zinoviev and Kamenev, the good students of Lenin, even came to acquire Lenin's style of handwriting. Trotsky idolizes Lenin, identifying Lenin as a man who could be loved, even worshipped in all his profound humanity. Lenin was infallible. Quote, every time that the Bolshevik leaders had to act without Lenin, they fell into error, end quote. When it comes to the problem of Lenin's role in history, in Stalin, the book, Trotsky merely repeats the earlier circuitous and contradictory explanation, arguing within the space of a page that both accident and necessity determine the outcome of the Russian Revolution. Lenin is portrayed as the apotheosis of October, with Stalin filling the role of its Antichrist. Trotsky's intended innuendo is that it is he who inherits the mantle of Lenin, only somehow the casting is out of synchrony with the unfolding of the plot. The mediocre victor, installed by a quirk of fate, can have but a short reign. Who sees better wins out in the long run. If right wins out, then history's passing aberrations need no specific explanation. Through the use of the device of personification, history becomes ultimately the history of essences, which work themselves out through humans as agents. New section, the final section, conclusions. The historical works of Trotsky analyzed here all possess some telos, which indicates the direction of the future already existent in the present. In 1905, a positive anthropology asserts itself in spontaneous revolutionary politics by manifesting itself in a personified mass. The history of the Russian Revolution is a more complex and considered work, in which mass spontaneous will stalls and recedes until the party machine falls into rhythm with it, at the hands of Lenin and Trotsky. The book Stalin, in comparison, is a perplexing work with no clear outcome, for in its case, Trotsky is faced with the difficult problem of explaining a specific retrogression which violates his philosophy of history. As has been seen, his response is to view Stalinism as a downward political fluctuation on an upward economic curve. So the overall situation is that while Trotsky's optimism is moderated by the passing of the years, It is never fundamentally questioned, let alone surpassed. Radically altered by its authoritarian face in power, Trotsky's anthropology nevertheless remains naively, if sadly, optimistic into the years of exile. Trotsky's major historical writings all share some teleological component. They become more difficult the more complicit is this teleology with the Soviet experience. Trotsky's own words illustrate the problem and its transfiguration across the Jacobin Bolshevik divide. In 1907, the young Trotsky had anticipated that history was a process in which, quote, ... our party, bracket, understood in the broad pre-Bolshevik sense, Preobrazhensky, why don't I say Preobrazhensky? Peter Beilharz, and bracket, ... will become absorbed without trace in a humanity which, for the first time in history, will be master of its own fate. The whole history is an enormous machine in the service of our ideals. It works with barbarous slowness, with insensitive cruelty, but it works. But when its omnivorous mechanism swallows up our life's blood for fuel, we feel like calling out to it with all the strength we still possess. Quote, faster, do it faster, end quote. In what seems to be a later case, Trotsky saw the relationship between history and party in a more instrumental sense. Quote, we work with the most correct and powerful ideas in the world, with inadequate numerical forces and material means. But correct ideas, in the long run, always conquer and make available for themselves the necessary material means and forces, end quote. Trotsky. So is the innocent historical telos of 1905, injected with the spirit of necessity and the logic of apology, history now finds materials adequate to history's ends. The early vacuous faith in the socialist future gives way to the more forbidding sense that the new dictatorship will be achieved not merely over the proletariat as collective, quote, actor, end quote, but literally over the bodies of its component parts. Is this element of the legacy of Trotsky which has become preponderant in the Trotskyist tradition? History has, quote, done it faster, end quote, ... at the expense of the tradition itself. That's the end of the chapter. I'm looking through the notes now to see if there's anything. Let's see. One here says, see, for example, Trotsky Results and Prospects, page 64, where Marxism, quote, is above all a method of analysis, not analysis of text, but analysis of social relations, end quote. In the book 1905, where the only acceptable analysis is that which foregoes historical cliches for materialist analysis. It's references some books that are important. I think it's Marian Sauer, Marxism and the Question of the Asiatic Mode of Production. Sauer, in Marxism and the Question of the Asiatic Mode of Production, indicates that Trotsky never referred directly to the Russian formation as an example of the Asiatic mode of production, perhaps because Trotsky saw the Russian formation as characteristically developmental rather than static in nature. Compare My Life, the book, at the political meetings at the modern circus. Quote, infants were peacefully sucking the breasts from which approving or threatening shouts were coming. The whole crowd was like that, like infants clinging with their dry lips to the nipples of the revolution. But this infant matured quickly, end quote. Trotsky. Endnote 23 says, in Volume 1, Appendix 1, Trotsky speaks of Siberia as marked by the combination of, quote, nomad economic primitiveness with alarm clocks from Warsaw, end quote, and observes that around the Belgian and American factory plants are villages of wood and straw which still burn up every year. There's a bunch of lists of instances where Trotsky uses natural necessity metaphors, boiling, sunsetting, tidal movements, instincts, eruptions. And there's a bunch of list of instances where Trotsky uses gynecological metaphors, and there's also metaphors of ulcer, death, and disease. The book that was referenced by Sontag was Illness as Metaphor. In History of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky parallels his task with that of the geologist. Elsewhere, Trotsky comments with specific reference to his history that, quote, history is a science no less objective than physiology, end quote. See, What is Historical Objectivity from Trotsky's writings, 1932 to 33, released with Pathfinder. Endnote 38 says, a notable example occurs at Volume 3, page 218, quote, the social ground shifted noiselessly like a revolting stage. Jesus Christ. Quote, the social ground shifted noiselessly like a revolving stage, bringing forward the popular masses, carrying away to limbo the rulers of yesterday, end quote. A number of subsidiary questions arise. Is it the masses on the stage or their representatives? If not on the stage, is the mass only the audience? To what extent is the action constituted by the director, and to what extent does the director function as censor? It says an early criticism, which is dated little, is that of L. Gottschalk's article, Leon Trotsky and the Natural History of Revolutions, from 1938, and B.D. Wolf's Leon Trotsky as Historian, from 1961. And Note 44 says, this tension in Trotsky between individual and historic forces surfaces later in the same entry, where Trotsky laments that he alone must now arm a new generation for world revolution in the Fourth International. And Note 51 says, in addition, there are strangely subconscious mechanical metaphors at work in the history of the Russian Revolution. The first, ironical, given Trotsky's later reputation as, quote, the man with the train, end quote, in the Civil War, is that of revolution as the locomotive of history. The second is the ironical reference to the, quote, forging of the steel, end quote, which conjures up the image of Stalin in the mind of the reader, but apparently not in that of the author. And Note 60 says, interestingly, Trotsky fails to take up the relationship of Stalin's provincialism to Stalin's nationalism. And Note 66 says, Trotsky notes that Stalin is possessed by, quote, extreme oriental laziness, end quote, and by trivialities. This latter is one of many tu quoque in Trotsky's text. The biographer's trivia, in addition to the above mentioned, also take in Stalin's rheumatism, the questions of his marriage to a believer, and his skill as huntsman, mediocre again, and as well as his truancy from meetings. Trotsky is obsessed by questions of when Stalin did what, for example, and with Stalin's place in the hierarchy of old Bolsheviks. Stalin is always last on the list. More explicit, Tekoch includes his own version of the doctor's plot against Lenin. The charge that the young Stalin was neither party builder nor centralist. Neither was Trotsky! And the gleeful discovery of Stalin's potentially Menshevik background. The book referenced is Boris Souverin, A Critical Survey of Bolshevism, published in by Longmans and Green, 1939, which I believe was translated by C.L.R. James. Endnote 70 says Trotsky even portrays Stalin as a stage manager, as director in the wings in Stalin, pages 232-237, 378, 413, but this image has no effect on his conscious assessment of Stalin's organizational capacity. As has been seen, for Trotsky, history writes the script, so the director can have no part longer than that of the actors in the play. That quote from McNeill that I was talking about earlier, Robert H. McNeill, is actually from the essay that I'm reading, Trotskyist Interpretations of Stalinism, in Robert Tucker's edited volume, Stalinism, Essays and Historical Interpretation. Come on. And it's over. All right.